Guys, you're welcome to part 4 of our motorcycle model. And in this tutorial, we'll be modeling other parts of the motorcycle like the headlamps and the back lamp and the exhaust and this carrier box in here. So now let's kickstart. So we can say 3 on our right view to go to our orthographic right view, and we can say Alt Z for wireframe mode. So we want to model this stand first. Let's do Alt Z back again. So we can say we can bring our cursor to this point here. You can say shift and right click to move your cursor. Shift and right click to move your cursor. So let's move our cursor to this point here and say shift A to bring an object. Let's go to mesh and bring in a cube, and let's scale the cube by clicking S on our keyboard to scale the cube. So we can move this cube upwards and say you can also move it to this point here and say tab for edit mode. You can say 3 for face selection. Select that face and let's push downwards. You can select this face also. You can say A to select all. Let's scale it a little bit smaller. S to scale. So you can say Alt Z so we can see the level of our cube. So you can say S and Z to scale on the Z axis. And you can push this inwards a little bit. So we'll say Ctrl arrow to add a loop cut, and we're going to push this up there. We'll say tab again and let's duplicate this cube. Shift D to duplicate this cube, and let's bring this to this point here. So we can select these two and move them forward a little bit. So I want to join these two cubes to become one object. While selecting these two cubes, hold shift to select this other one and say Ctrl J on your keyboard to join those two cubes together. And we'll say tab for edit mode, 3 for face selection. You can select this face, hold shift and select this face, right click, and let's go to loop tool here and let's say bridge. So now we can bridge that. But if you don't have loop tool, you can go to your preference, go to edit and go to preference and go to add on, and you can add your loop tool. So if I click on loop here, so I have mesh loop tool, so you can come here and check this and go to save to load that. So that's how to add your mesh loop into your scene. So now we say tab. So we're going to duplicate this, say shift D to duplicate, right click to release, so we can now move on the Y axis. So we can select this two and say tab. Let's select this two and say tab for edit mode and say A to select all. On our right view, you can say S and Z to scale on the Z axis, and you can push this inwards a little bit. You can say A again, you can say S and Y and X to scale on the X axis. Let's do Ctrl Z back. Think, say tab back to object mode. Select this and push this back here. So we have this kind of base here. You can select these two again and say Ctrl J to join and say tab for edit mode. You can select this face and this face here, hold shift and select this face and right click, go to your loop tool again and say bridge. So we can bridge those two faces together. You can select this face here and select this face here, right click and say bridge. So we have something looking like this, which is okay. You can decide to tweak this. You can select this and select this also, so we can either push this upwards, but I don't think we need that, so we can leave it this way, leave it very simple. So we have this kind of seater here. Can try to push this inside a little bit. And now we're going to create the box, which is very simple. Shift A to add an object. Shift A to add an object. Now let's go to mesh and bring in a cube. And let's say S to scale the cube. You can click 3 on your keyboard for your right orthographic view. And you can move the cube this way. You can say tab for edit mode, or Z for wireframe, 1 for vector selection. You can Windows drag to select all these vectors here. Windows drag, select all these vectors here. Just follow our reference. So we can say Alt Z back and say tab. So we have our box here. But first we can push this upwards a little bit. And we can take this downwards also. So we have something looking like this, which is okay for our reference. What we're going to do next is very simple. We're going to create our lamp, our brake lights, and our headlamp also. So we can come to this place here and say tab. Let's select this. So we're going to create something very simple. So we can say 3 for face selection. Decide to select these faces here and say Shift D to duplicate that face. Right click to select and right click to release and say P to separate that face. And if you say tab, you can now select this object here and say tab again to edit mode. You can come here and hide our, uncheck our subdivision surface, and let's go to back view. And now we can hide our reference image so we can work on this properly. And say 1 for vector selection. So I can click on slash to hide that. So I'm just going to shape this looking like a headlamp. I'm going to click slash again to unhide this object and say A to select all and push downwards. I can say slash. So I can select these vectors and say delete on my keyboard. Delete that vectors. Can come to my back view also and make this look like this. So I want a shape like this also. You can say tab and say A to select all and say E to extrude. So I can select all these vectors here and push outwards. I can select these other vectors also too and push outwards. I'm going to push this inwards also. I can say Ctrl arrow to add 2 loop cuts here. So if I say tab on my keyboard, I have something looking like this. So I can say Ctrl arrow again to add 1 loop cut here. And say Ctrl arrow to add 1 loop cut there also, just to tighten that up. And say tab. So I can add some few loop cuts also here, just to tighten this up. You can say Ctrl arrow to add another loop cut here. So I have my back brake light model now. I say tab A to select all. Can push this inwards, looking like this, which is okay. So if I come to my overlays here, I can select this and hide wireframe so I can see what I've modeled properly. I can either do some tweaking also. I can hold alt and select this edge and say delete and say dissolve edge. I don't think I need that loop. I want it to be very simple. I can select this also, hold alt, select that loop and say delete and say dissolve edge. So I want it to be very flat like this, which is okay and nice. I think this is okay for my brake light. So I'm going to create my headlamp also. So, but if you watch, we need to create these two lights here, and we can do it very well. And if you watch also, this light is kind of small, not too big. You can say select this and say tab and say A to select all and S. But first of all, I'm going to come to my clipping here. I'm going to come here and say apply in my object mode. Click on this and say apply. So I've applied my mirror modifier. I'll say tab again. I'll say A to select all. So now I can now scale, S to scale. I'm going to scale this very small, which is okay like this now. I can push this inwards a little bit. So I have my backlights looking that way, which is good. So I'm going to create another two lights here at this back, following our reference. Also, we have these two lights here. So I'm going to do that here. So I'm going to say shift and right click on this side of my back tire and say shift A to add an object. So I'll go to mesh. This time I'm going to add a cylinder. I'm going to say S to scale the cylinder to look very small. I'm going to rotate the cylinder on the x-axis arrow on your keyboard, X and 90. So it's rotated on the X angle at 90 degrees. So I'll say S to scale. I'll go to my back view again. So now I can now push this to this point. I can say S to scale and shift D to duplicate. So I have these two looking like this. So I can select these two and say slash on my keyboard to hide every other object, and I can say Ctrl J to join them together and say tab for edit mode. So I can say 3 for face selection, select these two faces and say slash again. So let's see how our backlight looks like. So you can say S to scale, S to scale uniformly. But if you watch now, the scale is influencing the boats, which I don't want. I can say Alt Z back again, and I can say 3 for face selection. I can select all these faces here and say delete and say Alt Z back. So let me just work on this and later on duplicate this mesh. So I can move this on the Y axis and say E to extrude and S to scale. I can say E to extrude again and S to scale inwards. I say Ctrl arrow to add a loop cut there and S to scale that loop cut. I can click on slash 3 for face selection. I'll select this face and I'll say I to insert and I to insert and I to insert. I'm going to say Ctrl arrow to add a loop cut and bring to this point here I'll say 3 for face selection, select this face and say I to insect. Now you can say I to insect also to that point and say tab and say slash to unhide that also. So I'm going to select this and say and push inward on the y-axis to this point and say shift D to duplicate. Right click to release and let's move on the x-axis. If I go to my back view now, I have something looking like this. So this is okay for my backlight. So now what we're going to create now is the headlamp also. So before we create the headlamp, let's create the exhaust first, this guy here, before we create the headlamp. Or let's just create the headlamp first so I can bring back my front reference and say 1 on my keyboard for my front view and say Alt Z for wireframe. Now I can turn on my wireframe also. So we can do something very simple. So this is looking like a Spider-Man eye. Can come to our front view also and let's select this and say tab for edit mode, 3 for face selection, select these faces here, Alt Z and say shift D to duplicate this face, right click to release and P on your keyboard to separate, select selection. So now we've separated this face from this object, so we can say tab for object mode. I'm going to select this reference here and select this face here, this object, and say slash on my keyboard to hide every other object. So what I'm going to do next is very simple. I'm going to come to my snap tool here. I'll click on this snap in here and I'll say face project and I'll come to project individual elements. So I can turn on my snap tool. So what this does that if I move the vertices is that this face here will be snapped alongside with the body with the surface of the bike. So I can say tap for edit mode and 1 for vector selection. I can now say Ctrl arrow to add 1 loop cut here. I can say Alt Z for wireframe mode. I can say A to select all and arrow to rotate. I can say G to move. Now I can now move these vertices following my reference. I can turn off my subdivision surface so I can move properly. So I'm going to move it this way. If I say tab, we have something now looking like this, which is good. So if I say Alt Z back and slash on my keyboard, so we have something looking like this. And we can come here now and make that adjustment on our bike here. So let's turn this off. We can say 3 for our right view and say Alt Z and let's try to push this guy downwards also and say Alt Z so we can see what we are doing properly. Now let's push this guy downwards and we have something looking like this. Say Alt Z so we can see it properly. So we can turn off our snap tool back and select this and say slash. Let's go to our front view also and make some adjustments. Alt Z and say tab for edit mode, and you can see we have some changes here, so we can just move these vertices back. You can say slash on our keyboard and Alt Z. So we just have to just move these vertices, ensure it's touching the surface of our bike also. So just ensure this is going inwards. Okay, I think this is okay now. So I can say A to select all and say E to extrude upwards on the Z axis, and left click to release that. I can say Ctrl arrow to add the loop cuts. I can add 2 loop cuts here. So I can say tab. So we can see properly. I can say tab again and say A. And I can say 3 on my keyboard for right orthographic view. And I can push this downwards. Push this downwards, looking like this. And try to make some few adjustments. Push it inwards also. So we can say tab again. We can add some few details. Ctrl arrow to add some few details here. You can say Ctrl arrow, Ctrl Z. So let's not add any more details there. You can say Ctrl arrow to add some few details, but it's going to deform the shape a little bit. So let's just add some few details. Ctrl arrow to add some few details. But I don't think we need those loop cuts. We can say Ctrl Z back. So it's okay this way, and say tab. So if we turn off our overlay and let's turn off our wireframe, so we have our headlamp modeled already, which is nice. So now we can now model this other headlamp here. So we're going to come here and say tab and say tab for edit mode, 3 for face selection. So we can select this face here. And let's say Shift D to duplicate, right click to release, P to separate, and let's click on selection. So we can say tab again. You can select this face that we separated and select this reference and say slash on your keyboard to hide every other object. So we're going to say 1 on our keyboard for front view. We say tab for edit mode and say 1 for vector selection. We can turn off our subdivision surface. You can say Alt Z. So now we can start shaping. Now we can start shaping our headlamp looking like this. You can say, you can click G twice to move this, all those vertices. You can select this and click G twice to move them also. Move this upwards. Move this upwards. And select these two and move this way. say Alt Z and say slash on your keyboard again. So we have something looking like this now. You can say Alt Z so you can see properly, you can see through. So we can say Alt Z back again and say A on our keyboard to select all and say E to extrude upwards. So we have something looking like this as the headlamp. You can say 3 for our right view also. Since we've selected this face, we can say 3 for face selection. We'll right click on it and go to loop tool and we'll select flatten to flatten that. So we have that straight up. But before we flatten, we can say Ctrl Z back. We can say tab and we can come here and apply the mirror modifier. Now we can say tab again, edit mode, and now we can select right click and say flatten for it to be very smooth. So we have something looking like this. So we can say 2 for edge selection, hold Control to select all those edges in that line. 3 for wide orthographic view, you can say Alt Z and we can move this edge forward a little bit. You can say Alt Z again. We have something now looking like this, which is okay. So we can say Control arrow. You can select all these faces also, and let's just push inward. You can say slash to hide. So you can say Control arrow to add one loop cut here. Now we can move this loop upwards. Control arrow to add one loop cut and select this and hold Control and select this. Now let's push this upwards a little bit just to give it shape. What we'll do next is we're going to click on this, so we have something looking like this now, and we can say Control arrow to add 3 loop cuts here, which is okay, and we can say tab. So we have our headlamp looking this way. You can say slash to unhide. You can say 3 for our front, our right orthographic view. You can say Alt Z and we can push this headlamp forward. And say Alt Z. And select this and let's move it downwards a little bit. So we have our headlamp looking this way, which is okay. So we can decide to do some tweaking also. You can say tab for edit mode. You can on our proportional editing and say 1 for vector selection. So we can reduce our proportional editing. You can say slash. So we can say 3 for face selection. You can select all these faces here. And we're going to move this on the y-axis. You can hold Control, Shift and Alt. Select this edge. I'm going to move it this way. Select this edge. Let's move it that way. And say slash on our keyboard. You can hold Shift and Alt also. Move it this way also and say slash. Now we can now push this inwards a little bit. You can say tab again. You can say 1 for vector selection. So we can play around this also. Just make some few adjustments. But I think this is okay for our headlamp. I think this is okay for it to be our headlamp. So now what we want to create now is the exhaust. So we can say 3 for our right orthographic view, and we can do Shift A. Let's go to mesh and let's bring in a cylinder, and let's say arrow X 90 to rotate, and say S to scale. So we can move it here and say S to scale, and turn on our wireframe and say Alt Z and say arrow to rotate. You can say S and Y to scale on the Y axis. You can say S again, S and Y. And say S to scale uniformly, and say G to grab, and say arrow to rotate, say S and Y. This is okay now. And say tab and select all this and say 3 for face selection. Say Alt C. So you want to say I to insert. Can release that, and you can say S to just scale this to this point. You can say I again to insert, and say E to extrude outwards, and say I to insert and E to extrude inwards, and say Ctrl arrow. So you can say 2 for edge selection, hold Alt, select all this edge, and say Ctrl B to bevel that, and if you scroll your mouse upwards you can add some few loop cuts there, and you can say Ctrl arrow, you can add just 2 loop cuts here. You can say Ctrl arrow to add 1 loop cut to this end, Ctrl arrow to add 1 loop cut here, to add one there, and say Ctrl arrow to add 1 loop cut here, Ctrl arrow to add 3 loop cuts here, 3 for face selection. You can say I to insert and I to insert. You can say tab, so we have something looking like this. You can say 3 for face selection for right orthographic view, or Z for wireframe, 1 tab, 1 for vector selection. So you can say Ctrl arrow to add a loop cut here, 3 for face selection. Can we just drag, or we can hold Alt and select one of these face, and we're going to say, so we can select this face, Alt Z, and say S to scale a little bit, say Ctrl arrow, add 1 loop cut here, and say S to scale a little bit. You can select this face, 3 to select this face also, say S to scale. So now we're going to say I to insert and E to extrude. We can rotate this. You can see you can hold Control and Shift and extrude to this point. Like hold Shift and Control, hold Control and right click on this side of your windows and say S to scale that. So I can just make this adjustment. You can say arrow to rotate. So I can say 7 on my keyboard for top view. You can say arrow to rotate this. You can hold Control and right click on this side of my windows here. So I have that extrusion to that point. You can rotate and move this way. So if I click on slash, I have something looking like this. I say Control arrow to add just one loop cut. You can just extend that. So 7 on your keyboard is for your top view. You can say G twice to move this. Say Control arrow just to create that curve. Control arrow. So I can say Control arrow to add one loop cut here. Control arrow to add one loop cut. Control arrow to add one loop cut here. And say Control arrow to add just one loop cut here. I can say slash on my keyboard back, my right view. So now I can now push this upwards to this point. What I'm going to do is that I'm going to rotate this also, have this looking like this, so I can right click and say mirror. I can mirror on the X axis, or Ctrl Z. So I want to mirror on the Z axis. Or I can rotate this also. I can say arrow X 90 or arrow Z 180. Arrow Z 180 on your keyboard. Arrow to rotate Z on the Z axis and 90 on your keyboard to rotate at the angle of 90. I can come now and move this to this point here. So I come to my back view and select this and deselect that and move this to this point. I can unhide that also. See how I can just adjust. Now I can bring back my references. So I can also add some objects to just fill this up. And say 3 for my right orthographic view. Say shift and right click to this point here. You can say shift A. You can bring in a cylinder again. S to scale the cylinder. Arrow X 90. Okay, arrow Y 90 to rotate on the Y axis. S to scale, and I can move this to this point here. S to scale. So I'm going to say S and X to rotate. Say tab for edit mode. 3 for face selection. I will say I to insert. And I'm going to say S to scale this. I'm going to push this inwards. Control arrow to add 3 loop cuts. I'm going to push this outwards on the Y and the X axis. I'll hold Alt and select this loop here. I'm going to push this to this point. So I have something looking like this. I say 3 for face selection, I to insert again, and I can push this inwards also. I can say slash and select this face and push this inwards. Say tab, shift D to duplicate, slash to release. I'm going to move this on the X axis. I'm going to right click and say mirror on X global and move this to this point. I'll select these two and say Ctrl J to join them, and I'll say tab for edit mode, and I'm going to right click and say bridge to bridge those two faces. So I have this now. So I can say 2 for edge selection, hold Alt and hold Alt. I can say S to scale also, just to give it, say Ctrl Z and say S and Y to scale on the X axis, and I can say S to scale also, just to give it some kind of pop-up. S and X again to scale on the X axis. So I can say Ctrl R to add just 4 loop cuts there. I can say Ctrl R to add just 1 loop cut here, and Ctrl R to add another loop cut here. So I can say tab for my object mode and say Ctrl 2 to add subdivision level of 2 to this. I can say slash. I can select this and move this inwards. Just to fill up that space here. So I can push this on the X axis and just bring this at the center here. And say S to scale. So I can select this also and say tab for edit mode, 3 for face selection, and I can just push this inside inwards. So I have something just looking like this. I can say tab and select this and just push this inwards also. I can select these two objects, push backwards. So I can also do Ctrl Z back. I think I want it to be there. So I can now just push this to this point. So but what I want is that I don't want this to be like this. So I'm just going to just make some few adjustments here. Select these two and say slash. So I can just push this outwards and select this and say tab or Z and say 1 for vector selection. Select these vectors here and say delete on my keyboard and go to delete and delete vertices. So I can say Alt Z and say arrow to rotate this and say E to extrude, release and say S to scale. I can say arrow to rotate. I can say E to extrude. So I can just push this to this point. I can say 7 for my top view. And just make this curve, hold say S to scale. And say arrow to rotate, looking like this. I can select this now and move this. So when I say slash on my keyboard, So I have something looking like this. I can say tab, and I can move this on the x-axis. So just to create something looking conceptual, just create that field up. I can push this backwards also. It's not looking bad. Tab A, select all, and let's just push this way. So you can add so many features to this also. You can decide to select this and say Shift D to duplicate. Move this on the x-axis, right click, and let's say mirror and X global. So you can decide to have, you can move this also on the x-axis. So we can decide to have two exhausts here. Move this to this point and move this to this point. So we can select this, select this, select this, and say slash. You can try to play along here. You can move this on the x-axis also, and select these two and say tab for edit mode, 1 for vector selection, or Z. Select these two vertices here, select these two and say delete, vertices, and I can hold Alt here and say E to extrude, right click to release, push and say arrow to rotate, select this and say E to extrude, move here and say arrow to rotate, say tab, I can select this and move this to the center here, looking like this, which is okay. Now you can say tab slash to unhide that back. So I want this to be okay. It is okay for me now, so I can work with something like this. So you can try to refine your model. You can play around things and see how things look like also. You can say Shift A, and let's bring in a cylinder again one more time. Go to mesh and bring in a cylinder and say S to scale the cylinder and say arrow Y 19 to rotate. Or you can say right click to go back. You can say arrow X 90, rotate on the X axis, S to scale, and let's say 3 for right view. You can say S to scale, say Alt Z for wireframe mode. You can say tab for edit mode and say 1 for vector selection. So we can be so creative, we can move this to this point here and select this and say E to extrude to this point. You can say arrow to rotate this a little bit. You can say 3 for face selection, hold control, right click on this place here and right click inside, and you can push this. So you can select this now and push, bring to the center. Just looking like this. And say 3 on our keyboard again and say tab for edit mode, or Z1 for wireframe mode, and we can push this inwards, or we can say arrow to rotate, and right click, hold control and right click on this point to extrude that inwards. You can say Alt Z, you can select this and say slash to hide, tab for edit mode, and we can say I to insert, I to insert, and say 3 for face selection, I to insert, I to insert, and say tab and say Ctrl 2 to add subdivision level of 2. You can right click also and say shade smooth, and say slash on our keyboard. So now we can come to our overlay and hide geometry wireframe. So you can also make some few adjustments here also. You can push this upwards and say tab or Z, 1 for vector selection, and say S to scale. You can say S to scale that, control arrow, add one loop cut, and select this and push downwards. And this is okay. We have something looking like this now, which is nice for a bike. You can select this and say right click and say shade smooth. Select this, right click, shade smooth. You can also come to add modifier, and let's just add subdivision surface modifier to make it smoother. Subdivision surface modifier, you can do that for this also. Add subdivision surface modifier, right click and say shade smooth. Add a subdivision surface modifier, right click and say shade smooth. So we are done with our modeling for our motorcycle bike here, and we can select this and say tab. You can also say slash to hide all, and say A and to select all, and say Ctrl B to bevel that. So if you scroll your mouse down, you can add some loop cuts. If you scroll up, you can add loop cut. If you scroll down your mouse, you can reduce the numbers of loop cuts. But I'm just make it simple. This is okay for our box. Say tab and we say add modifier, add the subdivision surface modifier to it, and say shade smooth to give us that round edge. So we have our box looking like this. You can see front view, you can say 3 for our right view, and select this and push this downwards. Say G to grab, and Z on the Z axis. Select G and X, and the X and Y on the Y axis. You can push forward, and it's okay like this. So we've come to the end of our motorcycle modeling, and in part 5 we're going to be doing some texturing, and I think we should just do the texturing now. I don't want to extend this to part 5, so we'll just go straight to shading and add base color to our model. So now let's add base color to our model. To add colors to your model is very simple. Go to where we have shading, click on shading, and it takes you to our shading editor here, and I can select this the body of this scooter here. Can select this and come to new to add a new material, and I can come to my base color and I can make this yellow. I can also come here, select this and say new, go to base color, and let's make this black, not pure black, but kind of black. So we can also select the tires, say go to new, go to base color, and let's make this black also. This kind of to this point. You can select this other tire and say new, go to base color, and let's make it black. What I'm going to do next is very simple. I'm going to select this also. I'm going to make this black. Go to base color. Let's make that black also. Make this black. Select the handle. Come to new. Go to base color. I'm going to make that black also. Select this handle. Go to new and make this black. So I'm going to select this also and go to new, into base color. So this time I'm going to use my color picker. Select that and maybe increase the tone. Check this. I have 0.995 to 0.800. Select this also. 0.995. 0.995 and 0.800, and this one I have 0.1. I'll say enter, and that's that. So I have the same color here, so I'll do the same for this part too also. Select this and go to new, go to base color, say 0.995, say 0.1 and say enter. So I'm going to play around with this also. I'm going to select this and say new, come and make this black also. To select this and say new, go to your base color and let's make that black also. And you can play around this, select this also and say base color and say 0.995 and say enter, and 0.1, enter. Select this other one too and say new, go to base color and say 0.995 and H 0.1 and enter. So we have something looking like this now. So we're coming to shape and we'll select this also. We're going to make this black. So we'll come to base color and let's make that black. So what I'm going to do next is very simple. For the exhaust, we're going to make this ash color. So I'm going to select this and I'm going to say new, base color, and I can decide to make this black also and see how it looks like. I'm very conservative about these colors. I'm going to make this ash color, not black. To make this ash, and select this. I'm going to also make this ash also. I'm going to select this, go to new. I'm going to make this ash a little bit. So in this now, I'm going to increase my metallic to this point. I'm going to reduce my roughness. I'm leaving my metallic at 0.564 and my roughness at 0.173. which I will do the same for this also. I'm going to increase metallic and reduce roughness. And I'm going to make this looking like ash color also. So I'm going to select this also and say new. I'm going to make the base color ash, and I'm going to increase my metallic and reduce the roughness. So I'm going to continue the process for this also. Say new, increase your metallic, reduce your roughness, and make the base color looking ash. So we've come to the end of this part 4, and in part 5 we'll be adding camera, we'll be adding backdrop, and we'll be adding what we call light, and we're going to render our scene, and we're going to do some basic rendering setup also, and we're going to render everything completely, and that will be the end. Part 5 will be the end of this tutorial. So thanks for watching. Please kindly subscribe, like, and follow me on YouTube, on Twitter, on Instagram, and please send in your comments and ask your questions, and don't forget to share this video. Thanks.